Metabolic syndrome is not an isolated disease, but a progressive biological configuration that reflects the modern body's inability to manage energy abundance and chronic stress. It is a silent state where several dysfunctions coexist without necessarily causing clear symptoms, while greatly increasing the risk of cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. Metabolic syndrome is identified when the body presents a combination of abnormalities, including insulin resistance, visceral fat accumulation, high blood pressure, lipid disturbances, and chronic inflammation. Taken separately, these markers may seem harmless, but together, they describe a loss of coherence within the global metabolic system. The central role of insulin is fundamental to understanding this syndrome, because this hormone normally allows cells to use glucose as an efficient source of energy. When cells become resistant to its action, glucose remains in the blood, forcing the pancreas to produce more and more insulin to maintain balance. This chronic hyperinsulinemia is not insignificant, because it simultaneously promotes fat storage, inhibits energy combustion, and disrupts global hormonal signaling. The body then enters a permanent storage mode, even when food intake is not excessive in volume. Visceral fat plays a key role in this dynamic, because it is not a passive tissue but a metabolically active and pro-inflammatory organ. It releases substances that worsen insulin resistance and maintain a low-grade inflammatory state, often undetectable through standard tests. Contrary to a simplistic view, metabolic syndrome does not concern only body weight or external physical appearance. It is possible to have a normal weight while presenting deep metabolic dysfunction linked to the location and behavior of adipose tissue. Chronic inflammation is another fundamental pillar of metabolic syndrome, because it reflects a state in which the immune system remains permanently activated. This inflammatory context alters cellular receptors, disrupts hormone production, and accelerates tissue aging. High blood pressure, often associated with metabolic syndrome, reflects a vascular adaptation to an unstable internal environment. Elevated insulin, inflammation, and arterial stiffness act together to increase the mechanical load placed on the cardiovascular system. The lipid abnormalities observed in this context are not limited to a high total cholesterol level. They mainly involve increased triglycerides, reduced protective HDL, and qualitative changes in circulating lipid particles. The liver occupies a strategic place in metabolic syndrome because it manages the storage, distribution, and transformation of energy. When overwhelmed by chronic excess glucose and fructose, it accumulates fat, leading to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This overloaded liver becomes less effective at regulating blood sugar and lipids, contributing to worsening systemic insulin resistance. A metabolic vicious cycle then develops in which each organ amplifies the dysfunctions of the others. Metabolic syndrome does not develop in a few months but over years, even decades, through a succession of silent biological adaptations. The body compensates for a long time before decompensating, which explains why diagnosis often comes late. Modern lifestyle exposes the body to energy-dense food, poor in micronutrients, consumed in a context of permanent stress. This combination is biologically unprecedented and places metabolism in a situation for which it was not programmed. Chronic stress plays a decisive amplifying role, because cortisol alters blood sugar, promotes abdominal fat storage, and disrupts restorative sleep. A stressed organism becomes less sensitive to insulin and more inclined to store energy as visceral fat. Lack of sleep also worsens these mechanisms because it alters hormonal regulation of appetite, blood sugar, and cellular recovery. Even with constant food intake, sleep deprivation promotes insulin resistance and inflammation. On a cerebral level, metabolic syndrome is associated with reduced energetic efficiency in the brain, which can manifest as mental fatigue and cognitive fog. The brain, highly dependent on stable blood sugar, suffers quickly from fluctuations induced by insulin resistance. From an evolutionary perspective, Metabolic syndrome represents an adaptive response to an environment perceived as unstable or threatening. The body stores, slows expenditure, and prioritizes short-term survival at the expense of performance and longevity. The problem is therefore not individual lack of willpower but a mismatch between our ancestral biology and our current living conditions. Understanding this mismatch allows us to move away from a guilt-based view and regain a strategic approach to health. Prevention of metabolic syndrome relies primarily on restoring metabolic flexibility and hormonal coherence. It involves allowing the body to alternate efficiently between storing and using energy according to real needs. This requires appropriate nutrition, stress management, sufficient sleep, and physical activity oriented toward function rather than simple calorie expenditure. These levers work together and produce lasting effects only when integrated coherently. Metabolic syndrome is today one of the greatest public health challenges, not because of its clinical complexity but because of its silent normalization. Recognizing it as an early warning signal allows intervention long before irreversible diseases appear. Understanding metabolic syndrome means understanding how the body speaks before becoming ill and how to interpret these signals with clarity. It also means restoring to health its strategic, functional, and deeply human dimension. If you want to explore the human body as an intelligent system shaped by the constraints of the modern world, I invite you to subscribe to the channel to continue this demanding, rational, long-term reflection.